It's great to be here with you. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person. And thank you, Diane, for inviting me to speak with you all, Bournemouth University. I was there actually just recently for a case. Absolutely wonderful place and very much a big fan of the beach in Bournemouth. Spent many a good day there. So I'm a barrister at Goldsmith Chambers in London, and I specialise in violence against women and girls, predominantly in the family courts and also across other jurisdictions. And I'm also a research associate scholar at the University of Cambridge, where I research gender inequality under the law. And Diane's asked me to speak with you today about domestic abuse and wider issues in the justice system, and key themes that will no doubt, hopefully, you'll see some parallels between this and your own work, and the way in which women are presented, especially domestic abuse victims, in the media as well, which is one of the big issues. And I'll come on to showing a few examples of that, especially in the tabloid press. So we know that domestic abuse impacts on a great number of women across the world. So globally, it's estimated that 1 in 3 women experience intimate partner violence, and the vast majority of perpetrators are men, as set out by rape crisis statistics. And there are, of course, 1 in 4 women that will experience and suffer sexual assault and rape in their lifetime. And yet, despite this, what we have seen, and we'll come on to think about the Baroness Casey report, is the decriminalisation of rape, as the former Victims Commissioner Dame Vera Baird Casey referred to it as the decriminalisation of rape, meaning that despite the significant numbers of women that are raped and sexually assaulted, there are very few prosecutions and convictions, and they've been at an all-time low of less than 2,000 per year, which has resulted in a climate of impunity for committing one of the most heinous acts that can be committed upon women and children, and indeed some men. And one of the sticking points, I think one of the key issues, is that very few women and men actually report rape to the police. And we know some of the reasons for that. They fear they could be disbelieved, they feel embarrassed, feel ashamed. They might be from certain communities where they're experiencing other intersectional inequalities, which means there are further barriers and layers that prevent them from reporting rape or domestic abuse. And of course, we've seen the press, how the Metropolitan Police, and we know it's not just the Metropolitan Police, but across the board, through work from Centre for Women's Justice, which submitted a super complaint. We know that there are police forces up and down the country that don't believe women and don't support them through that process of reporting male violence against women and girls to the police, and then going through the criminal justice system in some circumstances, which can then further exacerbate the trauma and victimisation that they suffer. Now, I've spoken about rape and sexual assault and physical abuse, but of course, that does not only include elements of domestic abuse. Coercive and controlling behaviour, particularly post-separation coercive and controlling behaviour, post-separation domestic abuse, continues sometimes after the relationship has ended or after a victim has escaped that abusive relationship, not left, but escaped, because that's often the reality of the situation, isn't it? Coercive and controlling behaviour, it doesn't necessarily involve bruising or physical marks, as I know many of you will be perfectly aware of, but it can be very difficult sometimes to evidence and identify when this behaviour and abuse is taking place, because it's taken place precisely for the reason of undermining the victim's confidence, self-esteem, and their ability to even identify what is happening to them. That is the purpose of this behaviour. So it makes them doubt themselves. In some cases, it can result in gaslighting, even doubting their own mental capacity and their own sanity. And I'll give you an example of a case shortly where that precisely happened in that case. And it can be corrosive and insidious and continue for many, many years. And what is important to recognise is that it's a pattern of behaviour. So on its own, it may not look like domestic abuse. For example, I remember in one particular situation where a woman described having to mark on the calendar every single thing that she did. Now, he didn't have to do that, but she had to. Now, that on its own was seen by some professionals as not constituting coercive and controlling behaviour, but put together and looking at the whole picture, that was one of many incidents where she felt deprived of her own autonomy and agency and feared how he would behave if she didn't comply with his demands. Well, you'll have all seen, I'm sure, the Baroness Casey report. I'm not going to go into an awful lot of detail about it because, well, the headlines really say it all, that the Metropolitan Police, according to Baroness Casey's report of over 300 pages, extremely detailed and evidence-based, along with a whole host of recommendations, shows that the Metropolitan Police is not only institutionally misogynist, but also racist, homophobic, and one may say bigoted as a result. We've seen officers like Wayne Couzens and David Carrick that have committed some most heinous acts of violence against women, and yet they are not isolated incidents as we see from this report. And again, it's recognising a pattern of behaviour within an institution establishment that is designed to protect women and therefore prevent this abuse instead of perpetrating it themselves, which, you know, results then in women and other victims not feeling safe in coming forward and reporting this abuse to the police when they're going to be abused all over again. And we've seen examples of victims saying when they've reported abuse to the police, so in some instances where officers have then pursued them in a sexual way or exploited their vulnerabilities in a sexual way, which obviously is reiterative of dominance, control, and power, and using their position of trust to continue that abuse. So this report really is, in my view at least, and my own personal opinion, is just a tip of the iceberg. It's an example of the Metropolitan Police, the largest police force in the UK. But what about other police forces up and down the country? So yesterday it was reported in, yes, I'm afraid to say, the Daily Mail, that Kent Police stuck this poster in a public space saying that the following non-emergency inquiries can be reported online via the Kent Police website. And as part of those non-emergencies, they included domestic abuse, they included rape and sexual assault, and even hate crime. Now, it's beggars belief that a police force would not only consider that to be non-emergency, but then to write it on a piece of paper and stick it up outside in public. It shows the attitudes, beliefs, and behaviours of those within the police force. That's not just limited, in my view, to the Metropolitan Police. And we need to lift the lid and open up, I think, the culture that's ingrained within those that work within the police establishment, if we are going to change this. Otherwise, as Baroness Casey says, the police have lost the consent to rule, and it could mean that the Metropolitan Police, and potentially not just them, has to disband when we look at overhauling and restructuring that entire institution. So I'm going to move away from the criminal justice system. You'll see there are lots of overlaps between the criminal justice system and the family justice system. And the reason for that is that the family justice system is obviously shrouded in secrecy and mystery and silence, because victims that go through this process are not allowed to speak out about it. But the judgments, or some of the judgments, are published. Whereas in the criminal courts, if decisions are made by juries, then of course they're not published. So you don't really get to understand how those decisions have been reached by jurors, or in the family courts, judges. You know, how have they decided that this person has been raped or not raped, for example? So I think it's actually, I think, very helpful to look at the way judges reach some of their decisions. Now, it's not just the criminal justice system which is plagued by the minimisation of domestic abuse, also the family justice system. So The harm report was published, and I'm afraid it says June 2022. It wasn't, in fact, it was June 2020, but the same issues, unfortunately, continue from June 2020 to 2023. What it showed is that when mothers in particular and children report domestic abuse in a family household, they are not always believed. There's a culture of disbelief. They're not heard. And stereotypes and myths are applied to how a real or genuine victim would behave. And the attitude is that whilst he might have raped and abused the mother, that doesn't matter in terms of the impact upon contact. And that's where it's referred to as pro-contact culture, or contact at all costs. Notwithstanding, of course, the trauma that the resident parent, the mother, would have experienced, and the child directly or even indirectly as a result of that abuse. One of the interesting parts of this report, I thought, and one perhaps for you to reflect on as professionals, is just how perpetrators and victims come across and how their credibility is evaluated by professionals, practitioners, and even judges. Now, this is an example here where it says, he gave evidence calmly without hesitation and was consistent. I found him to be a straightforward and honest witness. Her evidence was confused, vague, disorganized, and she made an unconvincing witness. This is an example of the types of professional judgments that you see within decisions made by judges about domestic abuse. And what it shows is that perhaps a charming, well-presented, so-called, calm individual that gives evidence is seen as credible, whereas a woman, for example, who may be experiencing trauma, may be experiencing memory loss, struggling to articulate what she's experienced and the consequences of that, is seen as very disorganized and unconvincing. And the harm report, I think, reflects very clearly on this, in showing that, another aspect of credibility highlighted in submissions relates to the appearance of the victim when contrasted with the appearance and demeanour of the alleged perpetrator. The unequal power dynamics in the abusive relationship are well documented now, on how abusers were able to convey an image of respectability, which gave them credibility and then helped them to convince professionals that abuse did not happen and had been exaggerated, which I think is so powerful in the way that it's encapsulated, because it really does, I think, reflect on how power and certain victim misogynistic tropes continue to play out and are used as weapons of manipulation within the system and within working with professionals. You have to be very well equipped and trained to be able, I think, to identify that. So despite the harm report and setting out very clearly the failings within the family justice system, Women's Aid produced a report which was 2 years later in 2022, and they showed that in fact there'd been very little change in the family courts, that training remains critical. There's a question mark over whether that training of judges and professionals is comprehensive and full, and that survivors believe that their children's wishes and feelings have not been listened to or acted upon. And again, that culture of misogyny, mother blaming, victim blaming continues. And there are concerns about parental alienation being used as a tactic to undermine the veracity of allegations of domestic abuse. And that proceedings, like in the criminal justice system, can be trauma-inducing, just like in the family justice system. But obviously, the thought of losing your children, I think for many mothers, the fear of that in the family courts is even more overwhelming than going through the criminal courts as a complainant, as someone described to me. Consequent to the harm report that I mentioned, published by the Ministry of Justice, there was a guidance case that was brought to the Court of Appeal. And there were 4 mothers, and the appeals were linked together. And I represented 2 of those mothers. And it was a really important case which set out the family court's approach to allegations of coercive and controlling behaviour that constitute a pattern of such behaviour. And it highlighted the way in which these allegations should be determined, and recognised that you shouldn't be looking at each individual allegation in isolation from others, focusing on a pattern of behaviour. And it also identified the long-term harm that can be caused to children through growing up in an environment of domestic abuse. So it really was a very powerful case. And in one of the 4 cases that I mentioned, I represented a woman called Ms. B. And in her appeal, she had alleged rape, domestic abuse, and coercive control initially. And she came in front of this judge, Judge Richard Scarrett. And he said to the mother that if she continued with her allegations of rape and abuse, then he threatened to have her child adopted and taken away from her. And you could hear the mother sobbing on the court transcript and highly distressed and dysregulated as a result of this. And the mother said that as a result of going through what she had, she then felt coerced into agreeing contact between the child and her alleged rapist. And that contact took place, and she feared that the child was at risk of really serious harm with him. And so she came to me, and we appealed the consent order that she said she was under duress to sign up to. And we won. And here on the right-hand side is a newspaper article where it sets out how the mothers in this landmark case felt. They felt belittled, disbelieved, and threatened. That's how they felt. And really it was an important case to highlight some of the injustices that these women had suffered, along with many others. But the lady, Ms. B, very brave woman, she succeeded in her appeal, and then she had to go through another trial, so what you call a retrial. And, I represented her, and she felt very intimidated and frightened by the family court and going through that whole process. And in fact, she actually ended up being successful in her case. And she got findings that amounted to rape and domestic abuse. And also gaslighting. So this was the first case where the judge had found gaslighting. And what had happened is that the father in the case, the perpetrator, had convinced the mother, my client, that she had bipolar. And he didn't just convince her, he convinced many other people as well, including professionals. And the judge says that the father's conduct represented a form of insidious abuse designed to cause the mother to question her own mental well-being, indeed her sanity. And it had a really significant impact upon her. So this mother as well, it's important to note, had also been dismissed from his place of work because of concerns that sexually harassed a 16-year-old inpatient and female work colleagues. And the 16-year-old inpatient was there for mental health reasons, so clearly very vulnerable. So just taking a step back and looking at what happened to her when she went through her initial trial and the judge threatened her, he said to her, this is why fact finds are a complete waste of time, because the result will be they'll at some stage contact will come out of the contact centre, and the approach is there'll be contact come what may. So why bother going through this whole process of proving you're a victim of rape or domestic abuse, which minimises the abuse inflicted on women and leaves them and other children at risk of serious harm. In this other case of GK and PR, this is a mother who alleged she'd been raped on a number of occasions, she'd been abused and coercively controlled, and she gave evidence at the fact-find hearing. And when she was giving her evidence, she could see her alleged rapist and her alleged rapist could see her. So there were no special measures such as a screen or a curtain or something like that. So as one can imagine that looking at someone who, say, has abused you, could actually prevent you from being able to give your best evidence. It'd be likely quite traumatic. And in GK and PR, a woman in the case at the end of giving that evidence said that she couldn't breathe. She was struggling. As a result of not being able to breathe, she was taken to hospital. She was kept in hospital overnight, and she had to listen to her alleged abuser's evidence from her hospital bed. So when he was giving evidence about, he said, not having raped her, she had to sit and listen with headphones on. One can imagine the impact of that on her. So I successfully appealed that case, which really was a horrific case. And then again in another one, I can't include all of them because I'm afraid there's just too many, but in this case of B&P, the judge, actually, let me just go back a second, because in this case of GK and PR, it's also, I think, important to emphasise that the judge in the judgment had said things such as the father saying, fucking die, I fucking hate you, nobody wants you. It was very abusive language. The judge referred to it as stuff of a matrimonial row. So really minimised and demeaned the significance of that abuse and suggested that the mother should just have broader emotional shoulders. One may say that as victim blaming. Now, going back to B&P, there are parallels between this case and GK, because what the judge did is downplay the alleged, and indeed some of it, proven domestic abuse, where the father had accepted he'd been verbally abusive to mother. The judge didn't consider that to be verbally abusive and undermined and minimised the seriousness of the abuse that she had suffered. And similarly, she had no special measures, which meant that she could see her alleged abuser when she was giving evidence and he could see her. In this case of Griffiths, I represented, she's now changed her name, Kate Kniveton MP. So it's a member of parliament who was raped and abused and controlled by her husband at the time, Andrew Griffiths, who was a member of parliament and a former minister, in fact. And at the time of him being an MP, he was doing these things to her behind closed doors. She ended up in the family courts to protect their child. And she improved her allegations, and she wanted to waive her right to anonymity in order to support and help other women. And indeed she did. But it was a long fight, because in the family courts, everything you say is private. And so you can't speak publicly about the abuse you suffer. And that effectively amounts to the silencing of women. And Kate said that preventing her from speaking about the abuse that she has suffered means that it's an extension of further post-separation coercive and controlling behaviour, but perpetrated by the courts. So really very powerful arguments, I thought, that were articulated, and they agreed, and she was allowed to speak about this. And that's thanks to two journalists for running this public interest argument. And she was also successful in another landmark case of Griffiths and Griffiths guidance on contact costs. And that case, I think, is a very powerful judgment, and one that I've wanted to bring actually for quite a long time. We tried to get an amendment in the domestic abuse bill, but it wasn't successful. The government didn't support that amendment. So that the contact cost issue meant that Kate, as a rape victim, was having to financially subsidise her rapists in having contact with the child in a contact centre, which comes at a cost. So it can be anywhere from £25 to £200, for instance. And she was having to pay 50% of those costs. So she was giving money to her rapist because he needed to have supervised contact because he was a risk. And I argue that that is further financial control perpetrated by the family courts, and she succeeded in her appeal. And as a result, there's guidance now against victims paying for their contact costs perpetrators. And indeed, at the time, he wasn't even paying child maintenance for the child. Extraordinary that she was having to subsidise him. And then in a further case, which was successful in this month, in fact, the judgment was published on International Women's Day, I represented Refuge, Latin American Women's Aid and Women's Aid in a guidance case that involved the disclosure of refuge residential addresses. And we argued that the addresses should be kept confidential at all costs, and that when court orders are served on women living in refuges, often as a result of perpetrators obtaining orders against them, that they should never be served on women at the residential address, because that residential address should be private, and police officers or tip staff turning up at the refuge would likely be very frightening for the women and children. So successful in that case. And again, that was actually an argument that we tried to push through in the domestic abuse bill. We were unsuccessful at that stage, but won in the courts. And then I represented another woman, which came about just before Christmas, where the judge had made comments about the mother's intelligence as a victim or an alleged victim of rape and non-fatal strangulation, and suggested that an intelligent woman wouldn't behave in a particular way, which, one can imagine I took exception to as her barrister, and we successfully appealed on and won, but albeit on another ground, but nevertheless a relevant one. But it shows the types of myths and tropes that continue to be played out in courtrooms. And when we're thinking about the justice system, of course, it's not just happening, is it, in the family justice system or the criminal justice system, There's that argument about what infects the other. Probably it's a mixture of both. You have the media and society, which impact, I'm sure, upon decisions made in the courts, and decisions made in the courts impact upon society and media. But I think it's important to reflect on some of the misogynistic media commentary that we see prevail, which does reflect, I'm afraid to say, societal attitudes. Not everyone, but clearly some people. You may recall Nicola Bulley, who had gone missing. Sadly has passed away. She was found dead. But at the time when she had gone missing, there was a media frenzy about what had happened to her. And some of the headlines that we saw play out, I thought, were horrendous. Commenting upon her menopausal state, perimenopausal, and alcoholist use, and already blaming this poor woman, and no doubt had an enormous impact upon her family without even knowing what had happened. I thought it was extraordinary, and remembering, of course, that the police released that detail, and then it was fixated upon by the media, and I thought in quite a negative way, in the way that it constructed her and no doubt other women, and made other women fear as well. If they went missing, how would they be depicted in the press? And then we saw Emma Patterson, a head school teacher at Epsom College, who was shot, murdered by her husband, and then he killed their daughter Letty, and then he killed himself. And the Daily Mail said, did living in the shadow of his high-achieving wife lead to unthinkable tragedy? Details emerge of the tensions behind the picture-perfect lives of Epsom College head and her husband who killed her and their daughter before turning the gun on himself. So the focus is on this poor man who's living in the shadows of his high-achieving, successful wife. He's been left behind because she has transgressed the roles and expectations of how a woman should behave. And therefore she's been punished by this man, and we should all empathise with him, or, as Kate Mann says, feel sympathy for him. And, these are examples of one woman Nicola Bulley, who's died, and of course, Emma Patterson, who was murdered brutally by her husband and a child. But then you look at just general media headlines about, creating moral panic, really, about progression of women's rights. So in the press recently, we saw a poll by, I think it was a Telegraph, or certainly the Telegraph reported on it, in respect of Gen Z and whether women's rights have gone too far. And the vast majority apparently said that it had, including the majority of men thought that it had gone too far. And you see these ridiculous letters in the Sunday Times, like, our boys are terrorised by false sex claims, and why Me Too fallout is wrecking the lives of schoolboys. And you think, my goodness, that, you know, it wasn't so long ago that we were talking about rape culture in our schools. And now the progression of women's rights and talking about toxic masculinity is being weaponized, as seen as oppressing boys and men, because the ideal of masculinity is seen as toxic and alpha and domineering women. And when you try and change that narrative, you're seen as a threat to the establishment and the status quo. And just here's a few other things to leave upon this note. I mean, just look at this ridiculous headline again by the Daily Mail. Scorn toy boy murderer jailed for 17 years for slicing his ex-lover's throat, was star at his local tennis club. This man wasn't even a tennis star, just playing tennis at his local club. And the focus is on him being a toy boy, being scorned, which therefore suggests that he has an excuse for having killed this poor woman, rather than recognising what he has done as being heinous and violent and abusive, and that he doesn't even deserve a role in this headline other than to be seen for the murderer that he is. And this, of course, relates then to, you know, sort of other attitudes that we see play out in the media. Like Lawrence Fox, for example, I think he's a presenter now on GB News, but of course you'll know him. And he said that a woman who willingly aborts a child should be regarded as exactly the same way as a man who willingly commits rape, heinous crimes both. I mean, it baffles me. What is a man? What's the difference between a man who willingly and unwillingly commits rape? I didn't know that there was a difference. Clearly, Lawrence Fox thinks that there is. And accessing reproductive health care, how that can be regarded as rape is beggars belief. And then we see, of course, Jacinda Ardern, former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Well, I don't know that actually she still is the Prime Minister, whether she has actually fully stepped down yet or not. But she had certainly resigned. And the BBC then say, can women really have it all? I don't think I've ever seen a headline that says, can men have it all? And of course, I think the Andrew Tate situation really encapsulates all of this. You know, are young men in crisis? Nobody seems to care. And you think, well, no, it's Andrew Tate and the likes of him and incels that are preying on vulnerable young men and some adult men, and grooming them into this narrative of hating women and being misogynistic and abusive and oppressive towards them, means that they are going to achieve and be as successful as him. So he creates this warped narrative about what it is to be a successful man, and then gets other people to follow in his footsteps. And it is part of a deeper problem in society, but women are not to blame for that, nor are we responsible for fixing it. And it's about time that men recognise their role in ending male violence against women and girls, and indeed boys as well. So I'm going to leave it there for now.